Now, the question is, how will the apartment industry respond to this? Are they preparing? That's the subject of the next panel, where we'll hear from some of the leading practitioners in the field. We're going to hear from the esteemed Doug Bibby, who will be the moderator of this panel. Doug is the president of the National Multifamily Housing Council, member of the Terwilliger Foundation Advisory Board, and we've got some top national developers like Daryl Carter, and we got John Hope Bryant, Larry Curtis, and Allie Solis. Where's Allie? Sometimes you can't really tell what Allie is because she comes up. No, I won't make any short jokes right now. Okay. Allie, you make up for your height with your brains and talent. Yeah, nice save, right. Doug Bibby. Come on, Alexander.
There I come, there I come.
So middle here is out for me. Middle, right?
You're right there.
Yeah.
Nothing like the after lunch slot. All right, you all have your caffeine? You ready? Good. So we're really fortunate today to have a panel of distinct yet very complementary models of addressing the affordability crisis in the country today. Our panelists have had extensive experience in working with models to meet the housing needs of the less fortunate. We heard from Ron and Secretary Carson today about the challenges that we face, and we know the statistics are quite chilling. So we're not going to focus on those. You already know the numbers. But we also know we're in an age of higher needs and diminishing resources to meet those needs. But in spite of that, a lot of good work is being done, and there are many successes being created across the country to line up households with the housing they can afford. So I've asked our panelists to focus on what works and what changes realistically can be made to achieve more success in communities across the country. To my immediate left is Daryl Carter, who's founder, chairman, and CEO of Avanath Capital Management, a Southern California-based investment firm, although he is born and raised in Detroit.
Detroit, the D.
And a great guy, too.
It's an investment firm based on conventional and affordable multifamily investments. Since its inception, Avanath has invested over $1 billion in affordable and workforce housing properties across the U.S. Daryl's also a managing partner of McKinley Avanath, a jointly owned property management company focused on affordable management. His experience in commercial real estate spans 32 years. He's widely recognized for his leadership. He's been a former trustee of ULI and was my former chairman at NMHC, I'm proud to say. To his left is Larry Curtis, who's president and managing partner of Winn Development and a member of the board of directors of the parent company, the Winn Companies. Winn is the 5th largest multifamily manager, but it's also the largest manager of affordable properties in the United States. Larry personally has had extensive experience in delivering both ground-up and rehabbed affordable units to markets in several U.S. cities. In addition to incredibly heavy load of volunteer work that he does, you can see in the book, Larry's chair of NMHC's Affordable Workforce Housing Committee and a member of our executive committee. To his left is Allie Solis, who is president and CEO of Make Room. Make Room is a national organization focused on elevating rental housing affordability as a national priority by mobilizing the public will to drive change at the federal, state, and local levels. Make Room strives to end rental housing insecurity by helping to improve financial stability and economic mobility. And Allie's background also includes 17 years at Enterprise Community Partners, where she led national campaigns in public policy, affordable housing, and economic development. And just recently, and I'm going to ask you to talk about this, Make Room announced a bipartisan congressional effort designating September 2017 as National Month for Renters. Way over on the left is John Hope Bryant, and we had a president who came from Hope, but you've got Hope in your middle name, so who is founder, chairman, and CEO of Operation Hope. In addition to his role at Operation Hope, John is chairman and CEO of Bryant Group Ventures and co-founder of Global Dignity. The mission of Operation Hope is to be the best-in-class provider of financial literacy empowerment for youth, aspiring homeowner households, and communities hoping to foster growth and expanded opportunities for the less fortunate. Since its inception in 1992, immediately after the Rodney King riots, Hope has served more than 2.5 million individuals and directed nearly $2 billion in private capital to America's low-wealth communities. So we're going to kick it off with you, Daryl, and drawing on your experience in buying and renovating affordable properties. What elements, again, we're focusing on success here, what elements have to be in place for you to achieve success, from securing control of the property to financing it to marketing it to your residents?
Big question, but let me start off by saying it's great to be home. I went to high school about 5 blocks from here, Cass Tech High School. Yay, shout out. And much of what I learned about what we do now, I learned in this city, growing up on the west side of Detroit about 2 miles away. And you know, just to briefly digress, you know, things were kind of, I grew up in a house, there were 6 of us, and including parents, in about a 900 square foot house. And things like childcare and things like that were taken care of because my mother was one of 13, my dad was one of 8, and there was always another sibling who was moving up to take a job in the auto industry, and then a niece or a nephew who would watch the kids while both parents worked. So it was a model that, and I think the secretary touched on it, where people, you know, it was not only that house, but it was that community. You know, I could be 10 blocks away, but they say, oh, you're that Carter or Denson, because there were 2 families, and they said, you're one of those kids. And so that, in many of the things that we do in our communities across the country, I take a similar model in that we don't invest just in bricks and mortar, we invest in the community, we invest in things like after-school programs, financial literacy, things like that. I mean, Secretary mentioned something that I took a little bit of an exception to, that renters don't vote. And one of the things that we have done in our communities is we create public forums where we bring elected officials to our communities. And USC did a study where we actually have a concentration of 1,100 units, and they found that since we first acquired a 600 unit, it was the largest and probably worst Section 8 project in Long Beach, California that we transformed. We then bought the 350 unit property next, and then we ended up buying other smaller properties. So we own about 1,100 units, but it represents about 90% of a voting district. USC found out that they did a study, the voter turnout in that precinct went from about 8% before we bought it to over 60%. Wow. And that's bringing people there. So. And that's a success.
Yes.
It is.
Well, you're also helpful in helping the media in particular understand that renters do vote. Okay, so back to my question. What has to be in place for you to be successful in doing what you do?
I think, number one, it requires a highly inclusive process, meaning that it's the residents, including whether gang members, elected officials, everybody. It's all hands in, and because it requires that, a community solution. We have bought, again, in Oakland, Long Beach, across the country. You know, and one of the things that happens in the apartment industry, we lose about 100,000 units a year for obsolescence. And one of the things, we try to reclaim some of those and bring them back. So it requires, one, a highly inclusive process. 2, one of the things that the enemy of affordability are the real estate development community. I mean, we buy Cs that are, that are in bad shape, and we make them B minuses. We're not trying to make them A's. We're not trying to double or triple the rents. We're trying to make it nice and to keep it affordable. And we found that in most of our renovations, we've retained at least 70 to 80% of the residents. And certainly the rents go up, but then we offer more value. For instance, we put washers and dryers in and things like that, where people are delighted to pay more rent. So I think it requires us to be reflective on the types of things we do with renovations. I mean, one of the things, I have one investor, and our model is we create private investment funds with institutional investors. So we've got to offer a attractive market rate of return, which we target low to mid-teen returns. And one of our investors will always look and say, wow, you know, I wish you could get rid of the popcorn ceilings. And I say, well, you know what? I could, but that's $40 more in rent I have to charge. I said, ultimately, people can afford a $300 big screen TV. They're looking at their TV, not the ceiling.
Terrific. I'm going to come back to some of that. So Larry, you've done rehab, but you do a lot of ground up development, and it's a good portion of it's affordable. How do you get that done? What strategies do you follow on the ground up side? Because that's the more challenging side for sure.
Well, first I wanted to applaud Secretary Carson for his concern and his wish and his goal to be the best HUD secretary that he can be and to help solve this affordable housing crisis. In housing, affordable housing is, everything's tied for first place. Urban, rural, new rehab, elderly family. We try to be involved in all of those components. We're building new housing. We're building historic rehab. We're doing what I call used housing, acquisition rehab. We're utilizing existing programs, federal and state programs, that have been long-standing programs, the historic credit since 1982, the low-income housing tax credit since 1986, to solve the basic problem that people with low and moderate incomes, those incomes can't support the cost of building. They can't support the cost of acquiring and rehab. There's a subsidy equation. This subsidy meets that gap. In new construction, it's actually the hardest. You have the neighborhood opposition of NIMBYism. You have, we don't want those low-income people in our neighborhood. You have the construction cost issue. You have the permitting issue. You have the land cost issue. You could pile them up and you end up in most metropolitan markets with housing costs at $400,000 and $500,000 a unit. Yes, $400,000 and $500,000 a unit to create a new housing unit. So as much as we attempt to do new construction, we find ourselves more so building new buildings. Where do we build those new buildings? We build them inside historic vacant structures. We build new buildings inside historic shells of mills and old high schools and old loft buildings in secondary cities and tertiary cities to utilize the programs, again, existing programs that can match with and bring down the effective net cost of that bar graph to housing costs that are affordable with people with normal paychecks. On the affordable end, for sure, below 60% of median, for sure, but also for middle income housing, for housing where people doing everything right, that they're making good livings, two-income families, and in most housing markets, housing can't get produced for those individuals and families. Think about it. People that make $60,000, $80,000, even $100,000 a year, most markets can't produce housing without subsidy. On the new construction front, Doug, we're doing it through the 9% low-income housing tax credit. We're doing it through mixed income housing. Many states, including Massachusetts, my home state, have been very innovative in creating middle-income housing monies. New York has done such to generate housing where a component is affordable, a component is middle income, and a component is market. We all know that's the best solution to create affordable housing, not 100% low-income projects, but quality mixed income communities. The short answer is being the expert. Among others, we're all the experts. We need more of them, by the way. 1 out of every 1,000 developers are involved in affordable housing development. We need more to enter this field to help solve the problem, but we work the existing programs in a manner that can solve the goal of creating affordable housing one development at a time.
So you just introduced my second question. I've known you both for a long, long time, and you're both very successful at what you do. And your investors and your owners are very happy with you. Why aren't more developers and ACC rehabbers in your business? It's a very good business.
I think they figure they can't possibly compete with our expertise and talents, and I think that there's among, Daryl, we certainly add to this, there's a sense that it's too complicated, and unless you're in the business, you can't get in the business. And there's also a sense I could make more money building luxury condos in whatever, Dallas or Boston or Houston, and or building office buildings in Manhattan. And somebody else is going to help solve that affordable housing problem. That's, I think, the sense. And it's a sense among companies as well. Amazon and Google could talk about big expansions. No, they're not thinking like, who's going to build the housing for all these individuals?
A simple answer, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
You want to elaborate on that? Okay, it's hard. We'll come back to that. Ali, with your goal of ending the housing crisis in America, you work to bring a lot of disparate voices and groups together and to create dialogue and actions. We're looking for ideas in this panel. So what ideas have been formulated based on these dialogues? And are there ones that we can really make a difference, but we're missing ingredients?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that we're focusing on solutions because we know how to solve this problem, right? We have the ability, we have the tools, we have the developers, but we need more, for sure. But we have to step back for a minute and understand that we need a massive narrative shift in this country, without which we're nibbling, on the edges here of addressing a crisis that's impacting, millions of families. And Make Room was really created to unhide this issue and to remind us that while the units and the developments and the production numbers that we cite and we talk about with Congress and the various programs are important, at the end of the day, they represent families, real people, our neighbors, our family members. And so, many of which are disenfranchised, many of which are struggling with affordability that is not just a coastal market issue. Larry and I were talking about this in the back, so he can add on to my comments here, but so much of what we focus on with respect to affordability suggests that this is only a problem in big cities and hot markets. I spent a day yesterday touring around in Detroit, and while they have a different set of challenges here, the affordability challenges remain. And one of the things that we want to ensure is we're looking at solutions that revitalize communities like Detroit. We see some great investments made by the private sector. Quicken's done an amazing job in doing some of those things, bringing new people and new communities. We also have to make sure that the very families, Daryl's families, his relatives that have lived here for years, have an opportunity to stay and have an opportunity to really participate in that resurgence of communities. And so I would say as we're looking at solutions, they need to be those kinds of solutions that really embody public-private partnerships, that don't assume that it is the government's role to solve and fix. And to your point, I think we're seeing in communities across the country more and more private sector, tech companies and others, some being cajoled, some being forced, some coming at it because their employees are demanding that they find solutions so that they're not having to commute 4 hours into their jobs. So I feel positive about what we're seeing. I try to be out of Washington as much as possible because the real innovation is happening in those communities across the country. So we can talk more specifically about how we lift up some of those solutions. Part of what we'll be doing is certainly continuing to share real people stories in communities across the country, but also really identifying those innovative solutions where new developers are stepping in to try innovative approaches, whether they are on the development side, right, new building materials. I know, Doug, you and I have talked about manufacturing. How do we think about this time of innovation with technology as a driver to help us think about new approaches to solving this problem? So we want to make sure that we are at the forefront of driving that on the agenda. And to your point, Daryl, voters in America are essential, and renters do vote, but not at the same rate as homeowners. And so that's something we have to change, and that is what we're focusing on. We have over 170,000 renters and advocates and voters that are engaged in Make Room. Our goal is to get to 1 million in the next 3 years, and so we can talk more about that. But I agree with you, and I think the kind of work you're doing with your residents of your units, engaging them and empowering them to be advocates on their own behalf is essential. We see that in the fair housing community, in the advocacy community, the space I come up from, but we don't always see that in the for-profit development community. We need to change that, and so we're looking for ways to do that going forward.
And so when you see some of the innovative approaches being done across the country, and you see some successful strategies, what does Make Room do? How do you move the ball forward?
So what we do is try to be relevant and bringing in new stakeholders into this issue. So we do things like trying to appeal to more millennials. One of the things we did last year, if you'll see outside, there's some concerts that we did with musicians. But one of the things we learned was, housing has never been seen as a social cause in the way environmental movement has and many other movements. So we wanted to figure out, how do we bring new spokespeople, new faces to this issue? So one of the things we tried last year was partnering with musicians, who, by the way, many of which struggled with housing insecurity as their careers built. That's an effort that will continue. So working with celebrities, really, to draw more attention. And to frankly, I want to be the mom whose kids come home and talk about affordable housing, not just some of the other important causes, whether they be solving cancer. It's just as important as getting young people to understand that this is something that they can play a role in and advocate for. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. And the other is also educating journalists and other key influencers. So we do journalist boot camps around the country where we take journalists, we take them to properties at places like Winn Development and see what's happening on the ground, help them understand the alphabet soup of federal programs, why they're important and how they work, and then we exchange content and put it out on the web to hopefully amplify this issue and spread new innovative solutions.
Okay, well, I've got 3 names for you then.
Great.
Oscar de la Hoya, Eva Longoria, and Bon Jovi. They all are investors in apartments.
I'm aware.
So
I'd love some connections,
okay.
Doug.
All
Great,
right.
we'll talk.
Make the connection. John, are you using social media there?
I do. I'm not this very second, but I am. Yes, I do.
I'm
voraciously.
I'm glad to hear that.
But I can multitask.
You're a champion of financial literacy. First of all, how did you get involved in that? And then you bring a tremendous amount of private capital to play in that. How does that all work? So let's start with the first question. How did you embrace, how and why did you embrace financial literacy?
I embraced financial literacy because my dad could make money but couldn't keep it. So the more money we made, the broker we got. My dad would make $1 and spend $1.50, and was too proud to ask my mother, who really was financially literate, what to do. And they divorced over money. I remember them fighting over money. But before we get to that, this is all very personal to me. Before we get to that, let me just say to Secretary Carson, God bless his work. We need him to succeed. But he really needs to take a page out of the book of 2 former HUD secretaries, both of which are represented in this room today. Jimmy Kemp is here. Jimmy's father. If you don't know the name Jack Kemp, something's wrong with you. Jack Kemp would have been a great president and was my friend, was on my board, and was a decent, wonderful, amazing human being. We went to Africa, and he met Nelson Mandela. He told me not to take a photo because Nelson Mandela didn't like flashes. And when I put my camera down, he put his camera up to the photo. I asked him why was he in Africa. He said because everybody's from Africa. That was Jack Kemp, Republican, and a great HUD secretary who reimagined everything. And Henry Cisneros. Please stand up, Henry. Stand up. Stand up. Who walked with me, I just saw him, this was unplanned, who walked with me in South Central LA after the Rodney King riots and asked what could he do to help, and gave my work credibility when many people were shying away from it. I think that what this sector needs is disruption. And things like financial literacy may not sound like it's supposed to be in this conversation, other than maybe as a soft issue. But that's part of the reason why the issue, in my opinion, hasn't gotten the lift that it needs to. The things that Daryl is doing is sort of the right path. But let me just say that Dr. King, social moral issue, his last issue was housing and poverty. He lived in a housing tenement in Chicago, rental housing. Take that story, run with it, retell it, and bring it into your movement. He lived in a housing tenement. His last civil rights bill in honor of his death was an Open Housing Act, signed into law by President Johnson. He said this: you cannot legislate goodness, you cannot pass a law to force someone to respect you. The only way to social justice in a capitalist country was economics and ownership. That was Dr. King in '68. Take that moral authority and use it. So I don't consider this affordable housing, I consider it dignity housing. What we have found is that something completely different is completely aligned with what you're doing, and it's credit scores. So we have launched Hope Inside locations across this country at Operation Hope, and we found that 44% of African Americans in this country, 44% of all African Americans have a credit score below 620. Let that sit in for a minute. Because nothing else matters. Racism doesn't matter. Discrimination doesn't matter. Police brutality, I don't care what the issue is. You're locked out of the credit markets. You can't get a decent mortgage. You can't get a small business loan. You can't become an entrepreneur. I don't care how brilliant you are. So what we did is we created a technology to move credit scores 120 points in 24 months. And we believe nothing changes your life more than God or love than moving your credit score 120 points. And we have found that 700 credit score neighborhoods don't riot. There's never been a riot in a 700 credit score neighborhood of any race in America's history, ever, because all folks with a 700 credit score want to do is go shopping. All of our problems in America are 500 credit score neighborhoods. You have a check casher next to a payday loan lender, next to a rent-to-own store, next to a title lender, next to a liquor store, and the only Solis is a church trying to make things better, and Daryl. And by the way, that's urban and black, and it's white and rural. And by the way, there's 15% of white Americans who have a credit score below 620. It's about 28 million Americans who are depressed, distressed, economically upset, who are looking for a voice and a spokesman for their fear. Now, so we have 102 locations we've opened in 24 months of Hope Insides. We're opening them every 2 weeks. We have one here at Detroit Medical Center. One of my representatives who works there is in the audience. We're opening one in Detroit Police Department because police officers are filing for bankruptcy at double the national average. We have them in school departments, but most of all we're in banks because the banks are in the no business because they can't say yes to a 580 credit score or a 620. They can't tell you this, by the way, for fear of being sued. So we get the bank out of the no business and back into the yes business. By having the applicant walk 10 feet over to us, we can do what the bank can't do because we don't work for the bank, get the credit score up, and walk them back over to the bank to get the bank into the yes business. So one of our partners has showed a 500% increase in bank referrals in branch year over year versus where we're not in their location. So this is not just goody two-shoes, it's business. So when you're trying to become a homeowner, you need an adequate credit score. So you need a launching pad for people to become homeowners. Right. Part of the subprime crisis was trying to take somebody who really was trying to take a size 5 shoe and try to put it into a size 5 foot in a size 3 shoe. It just didn't work. We tried to create borrowers and it exploded. So the second part of this work, so that's moving. The second part of this work, we have 500 locations on order for Hope Inside, is I launched the Promise Homes Company June of this year. That's a for-profit company with Tony Ressler, Michael Arrighetti as my partners. Tony Ressler owns Atlanta Hawks. And that's a for-profit company where we're saying to residents, as renters treating them as residents, $160 million company we capitalize. The largest owner of single-family rental real estate is a minority company in the country. If you raise your credit score to 700, reduce your rent by 10%, permanently. So people say, well, John, you're giving away the store. We're showing a double-digit return. I'll repeat, we're showing a double-digit return, giving away free credit counseling, free seminars, free one-on-one counseling, 700 credit score intensive counseling, a range of counseling support for free through Operation Hope. Then we take the vendor contracts in that same community, don't give it to any national companies. We say to the local plumbers, painters, the landscape people, folks who have a high school education with a trade, and we give them that as a contract. Because if you do that 40 hours a week, that's a middle-class job you're creating in local communities. So now the community loves you versus resenting you. The third thing we do is say, if you've rented for us for 5 years, we're gonna give you a path to home ownership. So now we're gonna endorse you with the bank to move you from a renter into a homeowner. And if you don't want that, we'll give you a payment holiday of 90 days because you paid on time. We're gonna let you get 90 days off because middle-class folks don't get a break. And we're still showing a double-digit economic return to our investors with no appreciation. So it's a lie that this is not profitable. Mm-hmm. It's a lie that you cannot treat people with dignity and respect. It's a lie that these are not good markets. It's just not true. And it does take more effort, but most success does. My last point, only in the dictionary does the word success come before the word work because it's alphabetical.
Doug, can I just make a point on that? That was great. Well, one point that I'm not sure most people understand, we looked at the demographic shifts that's happening with immigrants, really the largest population that's growing. Renters, right, that pay their rents on time, those scores, that great effort, that financial, responsibility is not being reported to the credit agencies. So so immigrants have the slimmest, amount of credit files. So they're the ones, and any limited income is then having to go to the check cashers or to the, rent your furniture places because they don't have an ability. If rent is the largest for 1 in 4 overburdened renters, right, 1 in 4 renters in America who are paying more than half their income to rent, if their biggest payment is rent and they're dutifully paying it on time, they're getting no credit for that.
Right.
And so that's another issue that we need to think about in terms of solutions and change that we could do.
Yeah.
CoreLogic, a
Yep.
Fortune 500 company, is now taking that data, packaging it and selling it, and trying to mainstream it. So they're taking thick file underwriting data, copies of utility bills, copies of rent statements, copies of phone bills, all forms of credit.
Right.
And now migrating it into credit files. So it is a big problem, but this is a huge opportunity for those who take it seriously.
So Daryl, with your residents, you've tried lots of different innovative approaches to enrich their experience in living in the community, and you frankly don't like turnover. You like stability of the residents' tenancy. What have you found most effective in terms of the services you provide? Is financial literacy one of them?
We do a little bit of that, not to the extent that John does, but it always starts, the first thing, when we acquire a community, and we have acquired some communities that are highly challenged. And the first thing is addition by subtraction. And I know it sounds simple, but getting rid of the bad people. I mean, if people create problems, nuisances, we evict them, and period. And then you start building a very strong community. And we sit today at about 98.5% occupancy nationally, and most of our communities have waiting lists. And I do think, part of security is consistency of a neighborhood, consistency of a community. One of the things that, at National Multifamily Housing or other industry forums amongst developers, you'll hear people say, well, we're doing value added and we're going to turn over the resident base 60%. Just think about that. When people live in, if you live in Bloomfield Hills, Newport Beach, California, Buckhead, you live in one of these very high-end communities. How would you like it if your neighborhood changed over 60% a year? And that's one of the things we as a industry have to stop doing, and to build more consistency, because once we have found that, particularly the issue of safety, once we've gotten rid of the bad people, we then, and develop a consistent resident base, we find out when there are issues, and the residents are the ones, and they rally around us, and we work with local law enforcement. And we don't create a police presence with security. We use cameras, and I can tell you, high definition cameras, they're really good. Because you could see, like, okay, no, your son did do that. Here's his picture. But I would say that it's one of the myths that we have when we're raising institutional capital. I had an investor recently say, well, if I come to one of your properties, will I get shot? And I said, I don't know who's after you. I mean, you're probably not going to get shot by any of our residents, but I can't tell what you do otherwise.
So Doug, I have a very strong disagreement with my friend Daryl. He said that the major driver of his business is getting rid of the bad folks. That's not the major driver of his business. I came to talk to Daryl about his business, and he didn't pull me out. He didn't pull out a spreadsheet. He threw me in the car. He's a big guy, and he took me to one of his properties. He walked the property with me. The people knew who he was. They knew him by name. He had a relationship with them. We went to the basketball court. They knew who he was there. There was a respect and a dignity he offered his residents, and they offered him in return being good citizens. Once again, it was the care, it was the respect that then drove the good returns. Right. So that was a nice, wonderful little response you gave. I don't know you don't want to be seen as a softie, but I want to give him credit for that. That I thought that was, no investor has ever done that to me. And the fact that he went out and he was not afraid to be in his own properties, not afraid to claim them, and that he knew the people there and gave them his business card.
You should see my own neighborhood, Detroit. I'm not scared of anything.
Amen.
Well, Daryl, you and I have talked about when you started the company and you began your first fund and the calls that you made, and you know, it's tough sledding initially when you're starting a fund, and so I want to turn it over to you, John, because you've channeled a lot of private capital into your business. How did you get that done, and how difficult was it for you to get that started?
People basically give me money to get me to leave their office.
It's a good
Now,
strategy.
now this is where I'm going to step in and I'm going to return the favor.
He'll tell you, I'm relentless. I'm
He
all
is.
over you like a cheap suit. And I don't wear cheap suits. I think I think that what we have said there is something to be said for being relentless and never giving up, because you will get a lot of no's in this business. I take no for vitamins, but you also have to have a good business plan. And our business plan is not, will you help me help poor people? That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, how do I help you achieve your strategic objective? It's a different question. And if I can prove to you that raising credit scores makes somebody more resilient, makes them less of a risk, makes them more blue chip, creates business and reduces costs, does that impact your balance sheet? I think that you can measure that. So it's a feel good with a return.
But I have to interrupt and just point one thing out about John. And to a certain extent, in us building a case for our business, I mean, the reality of it is we invest primarily in communities of color, okay? And it's a reality that, two things. One is we have a very diverse company that serves that diverse community. The second thing, historically, in many communities of color, there's very little data that supports things like economic return and the like. And the one thing that John has done, and certainly we've done, is we've created the analytics around the performance of our assets and the rent-paying track record, right, which is very, very high, but often doesn't get the credit. And I give John a lot of credit for doing it not from a very highly analytical basis. And that's what, I like to give him credit for that, because, he crunches the numbers.
So we've directed $2.5 billion, thank you, Daryl, $2.5 billion on the nonprofit side. And that's ramping considerably. On the for-profit side, again, the company started June, $160 million worth of capital, 4% cost of money on our first deal. The cost of money is going down, can't tell you why, but it's going down, which of course is very attractive. And we now are looking at about 1,000 units we're going to acquire between now and my birthday, February of 2018. We'll have 5,000 units under contract by December of 2018. 5,000 units, up from 0. So we're attracting capital. People actually want to sell us their assets. They want to be associated with a company that it is treating its communities with decency and respect. So there's brand equity that replaces the fact that we're not Blackstone yet. Right. And so I think that all those things together create some gravitas.
Great. We've hit a point where I can ask more questions, but I'd like to also open it up to the audience here. I can't really see out there. Oh, hey, Clyde.
You have one here.
Oh, do we have a question here? We don't. We do.
We do.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm really enjoying this panel, in part because this is the first panel of the day that I've heard talk about fair housing, which is so critically important when talking about this issue. Because if we have artificial and unfair barriers that block access to safe and affordable and decent housing, then we really aren't, we're not talking about a game-changing situation. And Ali, I was really happy to hear you talk about the credit issue, in particular because communities of color, people with disabilities, and new immigrant populations are disproportionately credit invisible and have, for the entire history of our nation, been forced into accessing credit in the non-traditional credit space, which, as you pointed out, Ali, creates a scenario where they don't have any identifiers in the credit repository system so that they can be picked up by credit scoring agencies. And so I was just wondering, particularly for the housing providers, if you could provide some feedback and information on whether or not you look at an applicant's credit score when deciding whether or not to rent to that person. And it seems like the market, particularly the fair market, has moved in that direction. And I'm just wondering if you have some insights for us about how we can expand opportunities for folks who traditionally have been locked out of the financial mainstream. And I'm sorry, I'm Lisa Rice from the National Fair Housing Alliance.
So I'll start, and then maybe Daryl and others can talk about renting to renters directly. So one of the things that we're doing is partnering with the Credit Builders Alliance, which is a group of CDFIs across the country who are, in fact, have established relationships with the credit reporting agencies and are helping families establish credit, repair credit, partnering with financial literacy folks to help also think about new asset accumulation. But I think that's a really critical issue, and one of the things that we're trying to do as a connector to service providers as we're raising awareness about the challenges that these renters are facing.
So incomes, of course, are important. Credit scores are important. Prior landlord history is important. Non-discrimination, again, all of them extremely important. Credit scores, of course, are looked at. We've run 100,000 units, 523 communities, a lot of tenant empowerment, resident empowerment, co-ownership, true co-ownership on properties, wealth created for tenant organizations, and relative to credit and incomes, we try to be flexible. We try to be not the tough landlord that says something happened 10 years ago, you can't come into this community. We try to provide. And what we have found, and this was suggested already, is if you provide high quality housing with known ownership and known management and long-term ownership and management, that residents, yes, even low income residents, moderate income residents, middle income residents, will take care of the community, build upon the community, and create great lives for themselves, despite the income, despite the lesser income relative to some others in our society. So when you go into a community, there's often the sense that, oh, it's those people, and that could be a racial viewpoint, it could be an economic viewpoint. We find once these communities are rehabilitated, and once they're well run, that despite credit scores, despite low incomes, that they become great places for people to live. Not just day one, less turnover, and great communities.
I would just add one thing. Again, many of the things I learned about this business, I learned here. My Aunt Jessie owned about 50 houses in Detroit, and she rented them. And later on, I got in the business, and I asked, I said, well, Aunt Jessie, how did you find, what was your tenant screening process? She said, I put up a notice when I had a unit at the church, and then I'd get an applicant, and that's who I put in. I said, well, what if they didn't pay? She said, I'd put up notice at the church and say they were delinquent. They would always pay. But we don't necessarily operate like that. But I do remember that because, and it's interesting, many of our referrals in our communities come from family members. And they'll have a family member and they say they're, and they'll be on our waiting list and we get to them. And part of it, we know that family. And we know that maybe their credit score is a little off, but they're going to pay because that family's been there for a number of years. And they don't want to see that family member fail.
Right. We've got a question out here.
Earlier today, we heard the demographics that we're all familiar with, that we are an aging population. I think the numbers were 2/3 of the renters now are 65 or over, and by 2030, we'll have 75 million people over 65. I just entered that last week. How are we going to address the needs of our most important element of our society, our seniors, with respect to affordable rental housing?
You know, one of the things that we see in our business, an interesting phenomenon exists in the U.S. Since 2000, only 8% of the apartments built are 3-bedroom or larger. So a lot of the older communities that we buy and we renovate, we have 3 and sometimes 4. We have, I think, 12 communities where we have 4-bedroom units. Most of those 3s and 4s are occupied by multi-generational families. And that is really, I think, part of the solution for aging in place is multi-generational families. I mean, it's the way, my grandparents lived with us when we were growing up, and so I think that is, one of the strategies. Unfortunately, we're building these micro units of 300, geared at the millennials, when in what we see the demand is for larger units with older residents.
But I would just say that I think there's some innovative approaches that are also happening out there. So in California, they just passed ADU legislation. As someone whose father lives with her and whose mother rents out now her 3 empty bedrooms, we really think that there's an opportunity to look at barriers, to the regulatory barriers that are prohibiting some more non-traditional approaches towards shared housing and those kinds of either accessory dwelling units through ADUs that could provide additional rental income for those more seniors that could age in place, as well as new opportunities to think about multi-generational housing in this country.
We have time for one more question over there.
Thank you. Okay. My question, I'm Donna Givens from Eastside Community Network in Detroit, and my question, when you talk about raising credit, which I think is awesome, but when you look at the percentage of homes that are rent burdened, when I think of a rent burdened home, I'm thinking of a home that probably doesn't have the best credit in the world. And so I'm wondering, to what extent are there levers to change that? What are the things that you can change within that time frame to improve people's credit scores, given the fact that many people are paying 60% of their income on rent, and we have an income problem as well as a credit problem in our community?
Yes. So by the way, on the seniors issue, my mother just sold a home in Houston, moved to Atlanta, moved into what I call a rental resort. A seniors resort. It's an apartment building with a concierge desk up front. They got Zumba class, they got a Tai Chi class, she has a nail salon in there. You can't get my mother out of the place. And they sold out in a year. And these people pay their rent like clockwork, very dependable. So I think the market will solve some of this, because I think I tried to buy the building after I put her in there. The guy wouldn't sell it. So I think the market will solve some of it. So let me go to your point. So there are no skyscrapers in our neighborhood. We've got to stop looking at big companies, who are not hiring, by the way, to hire low-income and struggling people from these communities. When you can't get a job, what we teach at Operation Hope is create a job. What's a drug dealer if not an illegal, unethical entrepreneur? And they may be unethical, and there's a special place in hell reserved for them, but they're not dumb. They understand import, export, finance, marketing, wholesale, retail, customer service, security, territory, logistics. So you're not talking about dumb. That's funny, by the way. It's okay to laugh. We got sued. You're not going to talk about dumb people. You're talking about misdirected people with bad role models. And the guy who made this suit had a challenged background, wanted to go become a designer. I told him no one's going to hire you, not because of racism. Nobody knows you in Manhattan. You're in LA. Why don't you create your own design house? He never thought about it. We raised his credit score. Got him in the small business class for free at Operation Hope. A year later, we vouched for him at the bank, Union Bank. He got a $35,000 loan. He's doing $1.6 million today every year with 6 employees. And he makes all of my suits, including this cool shirt that has my signature on it. What's the better investment? Was it better investment to try to get this guy, shoehorn this guy into some job that probably wasn't going to be for him anyway, right? Or he got bounced out right away because cousin Joe would have put their cousin in, or to help him now have a 10-year-old business that's produced almost $20 million worth of revenue and created local jobs. Every big business was once a small one. And we forget in this country that poor people created all of this wealth. We forget about it. Sam Walton was a pickup truck in a storefront and a high school education. That's called Walmart today. We have lost our storyline. And I think that part of the solution is going back to the basics and in creating small businesses and entrepreneurs and self-employment projects in our communities. We've done that too at Operation Hope.
I've gotten the hook sign, but thank you very much, panel, for fascinating discussion.
Daryl, good seeing you. Good meeting you.
Doug Bibby on time. I love it. Good job. Great. Great. Good. Section 3.